All right, well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Collection. We are excited to return with another episode where we'll share some interesting items from the Chapman Museum's collection. My name is Becca, and I am the Program and Outreach Coordinator.
And my name's Maureen, and I'm the curator.
Maureen, do you know why the month of March is so important?
Of course I do. It's Women's History
It
Month.
is! Yay! Yes, Women's History Month has been celebrated every year in March since 1987. It is a chance for everyone to celebrate women's contributions to history, culture, and society. And since From the Collection is hosted by two women, we thought it was only right to share some objects from our collection here at the Chapman that relate to women's history. And we are very happy to have our special guest, Catherine the Mouse, joining us today. Welcome, Catherine.
Hello, everyone! I'm so excited to be here today!
Well, that is good to hear, Catherine. Do you know a lot about women's history?
Yes! I know all about Florence Nightingale and then Susan B. Malthany.
Who?
How can you not know about Florence Nightingale and Susan B. Malthany? They're two incredibly important female mice.
Okay. Well, today's episode is about human women, Catherine, not mice. I hope that's okay.
Oh.
But I promise you, the objects we're sharing today are really cool and relate to some wonderful stories about women standing up for what is right.
Well, that sounds interesting. Now, the last time I was here, you talked about how there are primary and secondary sources at the museum. Are these objects primary sources?
They are. Do you remember what a primary source is, Catherine?
Ooh.
I think so. A primary source is an object used or created by someone in the past.
Nice job. And do you think you can come up with some examples of primary sources?
Well, the last time, the miniature portrait was a primary source, and so was the chocolate box. So I guess it could be just about anything.
Yeah, a primary source can be a lot of different things. Letters, photographs, artifacts, clothing, and speeches. Those are all examples of primary sources. We use primary sources to help us learn about the past. And here at the Chapman, we have primary and secondary sources stored in our archives and collection spaces.
For each primary source we discuss today, we'll learn about the period in history it came from and what it was used for and any other important information. But before we look at any objects, I want you to take some time to think about what you already know about women's history. It can be important events in women's history, the names of important women or famous women, or something else related to the topic. And if you'd like, you can write down your ideas so you don't forget them. And if you need more time, you can always pause the video right here. All right, so now that you've given that question some thought, I'm going to provide you with some historical context or background information that will help you better understand what was happening when this object, or our first object, was being used. So our first object comes from the Progressive Era, which historians usually say took place between the 1890s and the 1920s. We talked a little bit about this era before, but today we're going to go into much more depth. But before we talk about the Progressive Era, we need to talk about the period before that, which was called the Gilded Age. We're going to do just a very brief overview of the Gilded Age, but if you want more information on the Gilded Age, we talked about this in our second episode, which is called Gilded Age Amusements. So you can check that out if you want more info. So back to the Gilded Age. So the United States had grown up very quickly during the Gilded Age. The country had become more urban, meaning more people were living in cities than on farms. Factories had sprung up in places like Chicago and New York, and these factories employed lots of people. And also at this time, thousands of immigrants had arrived and were looking for a better life in America. We see that today still. And while it was a time of great growth, it was also a time of great inequality. Those who worked in the factories were often immigrants, and they often suffered under horrible working conditions. Factories were dark and noisy and dangerous places. Workers frequently worked up to 12 hours a day. That is a long time, 6 days a week. The air inside factories was unhealthy, and workers could get sick from it. And the machines and equipment that they are using to do their jobs were very large and heavy, and if workers weren't careful, they could get their hands, their hair, or their fingers caught in them. And unfortunately, sometimes if a family wasn't making enough money with just the parents working, their children would also have to go to work as well. It was also common for certain groups of people to be discriminated against. Discrimination is when you treat someone unfairly because of their race, gender, age, disability, or another reason. Discrimination is wrong, but it was very common during the Gilded Age and during the Progressive Era. And unfortunately, there are still people who face discrimination today. One of the groups impacted by discrimination were immigrants. Immigrants were often looked down upon because they didn't speak English well, they might have practiced a different religion, or other reasons. But unfortunately, many immigrants still face discrimination and prejudice today. Another group impacted by discrimination were African Americans. Although slavery was no longer legal, Black people were treated differently than white people and were often segregated from whites. This meant they were kept separate from white people and were required to use different entrances to buildings, sit in designated areas, and even go to different schools. African Americans were often denied certain jobs, and they often faced acts of violence. Women also experienced discrimination. During the Gilded Age and most of the Progressive Era, women were not allowed to vote. They were often paid less than men at their jobs. And sometimes they were even denied certain jobs just based on their gender. And some colleges and universities wouldn't admit them at all. Now, some people during this time saw all of these problems and decided enough was enough. It was time for change. Progressives, or someone who wants to address the problems they see and make progress towards a better society, were unhappy with the way things were done, and they wanted to make changes. This is where the Progressive Era gets its name from. It was a period of great social, economic, and political change in the United States, with lots of people trying to make the country better and fairer for all. We don't have time to talk about every single person who strived to make change during the Progressive Era, so we're just going to focus on a few, and since it's Women's History Month, I thought we'd focus on some female progressives. So our first is Jane Addams. Jane Addams was very unhappy with the treatment of the poor, many of which were immigrants. So to help with this, she founded a place called Hull House, which was the first settlement house in the United States. A settlement house was a place, usually in a poorer section of a city, where people could receive food, medicine, education, childcare, and more. Settlement houses especially helped new immigrants by helping them settle in their new country. They did this by teaching them English, providing job training, giving them cultural experiences, and more. Jane even added an art gallery to Hull House so that everyone, both the rich and the poor, could experience art.
Whoa! Jane did all that?
And more. We could spend days talking about all the things Jane Addams did, but we need to move on to our next progressive reformer, Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was a Black journalist who wrote about the injustices African Americans faced on a daily basis. One of her main focuses was on lynchings in the South. Lynching is a very serious crime in which a person is killed by a mob of people. Black men were being lynched in the South by mobs of white men, and Ida B. Wells documented this in her writings, and she published dozens of editorials and pamphlets in which she advocated or supported laws that would make lynching a crime. And it took 100 years, but in 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law a bill that makes lynching a federal crime. The last progressive reformer we're going to talk about is Alice Paul. She was a suffragist, or someone who supported women's suffrage or women's right to vote. Catherine, remember in the last episode when I mentioned that women in the 1830s couldn't vote?
Yes!
Well, almost 90 years after that,
Yes?
women still didn't have the right to vote. I know. And Alice Paul felt the same way. The women's suffrage movement started back in the 1840s, and by the 1910s, they hadn't made all that much progress. Alice Paul decided that the movement needed to be shaken up. So she encouraged more radical ways of fighting for women's right to vote, like protests, marches, and picketing government officials. Finally, I want to share a map of the country during the 1910s, the decade when our first object was from. At this point in history, there are 48 states, and the president was Woodrow Wilson. So, with all that historical context in mind, it is time to look at our first object. Maureen, would you like to show it off?
I'd be happy to.
All right.
All right. As I'm displaying the object, I want you to start thinking about what you notice. Think about the object's size, shape, color, what materials it might be made out of. Feel free to pause. Write down your observations if you'd like. Here, I'll get a nice close.
Yeah, there we go. All right, excellent. All right, and now that you've seen our first object, it is time to start making some educated guesses as to what it is or what it could have been used for. So based on what you noticed and the historical context we just gave you, try to determine what you think this object is or what it was used for. And again, if you want, you can take a minute, you can pause the video, you can write down your guesses if that will help you.
Maureen, before you reveal the answer, can I take a guess?
Sure, Catherine, go ahead.
I think it was a flag used by the suffragists.
You're right. This is a pennant or a flag that was used to promote women's suffrage. So we don't know who exactly owned this pennant, but we can make an educated guess that they probably supported women's suffrage.
Makes sense. Is there anything that can tell us about this particular pennant, Maureen?
Well, this one in particular is made of cloth, possibly felt or wool, and it would have been attached to a stick or a post so that it could be waved around. There's a small hole on the side.
Is it? Oh, the small hole, is it over there?
Oh, on this side,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Which tells us that at one point it also might have been pinned up to a wall or a bulletin board.
Okay, so the stick would have been right over here?
Yes,
probably.
the stick could have been on this side here.
Very cool. All right, does the color mean anything?
Yes, so if you were to search suffrage pennants online, you would see tons of yellow flags, and that's because yellow or gold was one of the colors of the suffrage movement.
Oh.
Some historians say that this color was picked because it matched the color of sunflowers, which the Kansas suffragists used as a symbol of the movement. Purple and white were also popular colors associated with women's suffrage.
Very cool.
And one of the ways Alice Paul intended to get more support and publicity for women's suffrage was by leading large marches or protests. And participants often wore sashes that said "Votes for Women," just like the pennant. They could also carry banners, pennants, flags as they marched. And they also sold postcards and pennants with the slogan "Votes for Women" as a way to raise money for their cause.
Very cool.
And do we know when it was used, Maureen?
We don't have an exact date, but our best guess is that this pennant was used between 1913 and 1918. So this is a really pivotal time in the women's suffrage movement.
Why is that?
Well, I can answer that, Catherine, because on March 3rd, 1913, the National American Women Suffrage Association, a group that was fighting for a woman's right to vote, held a large march or parade in Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States. Alice Paul and her friend Lucy Burns organized the march, and 5,000 women participated. There were parade floats, there were dancers, there was marching bands, some women even wore elaborate costumes, and they all marched behind a woman named Inez Milholland, who led the parade on horseback, wearing a long white dress, a cape, and a gold tiara.
Wow.
Yeah, she does look pretty cool. So behind Inez was a big float that had a sign that read, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country."
What's an amendment?
An amendment is a change to a law. The women marching wanted an amendment to the Constitution that would give them the right to vote.
Did the march work? Did they get the amendment passed?
Well, the march certainly got a lot of attention. It was on the front page of a lot of newspapers, but no amendment got passed, right away at least. So, starting in 1917, Alice Paul came up with another bold idea to get people's attention, in particular, the president, Woodrow Wilson. She organized the Silent Sentinels to picket outside of the White House. Each day, a group of women would stand outside the gates of the White House holding banners that read things like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Liberty is freedom, and in this case, the women wanted the freedom to vote. This was a non-violent form of protest that went on for about 2 years. So just like the march, the Silent Sentinels got a lot of attention, but not all of it was good. Sometimes the women faced verbal and physical attacks from spectators or people passing by. They were jeered at and spit on. Some of them were even arrested and put in prison, even though they were just exercising their right to peacefully protest. Eventually, President Wilson announced his support for women's suffrage, and then finally, after nearly 100 years, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and it gave women the right to vote. It is a great thing, Catherine, but we can't forget to mention that while the 19th Amendment did give women the right to vote, many women of color were often denied the ability to do so. Native American women didn't gain the right to vote until 1924, and Black women were often prevented from voting. Sometimes they were required to pay a poll tax, which was a fee to vote. Other times they had to take a literacy test, which was supposed to be a way to prove a voter could read and write. But often these tests were so tricky that they were really hard to pass, even if you could read and write. It wouldn't be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that these practices would be made illegal. Ooh.
Catherine, is that a new accessory you have on?
It.
It's my new sash. It has the colors of the suffrage movement. And I'm going to wear it to remember the women who worked so hard to fight for the right to vote.
Oh, Catherine, that's very sweet of you. I love the sash. And you are so right. They did have to fight hard. And the women who came after them also fought hard during World War II, which is the period our next object comes from. So, as the name suggests, World War II was a global conflict, meaning it involved numerous countries across the world. It was fought mostly between 1939 and 1945 and involved two main sides: the Axis powers, which were composed of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied powers. The major countries of the Allied powers included the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, which we know today as Russia. Other countries like China, Australia, and France also helped the Allies. While most of Europe and Asia had been fighting in World War II since 1939, the United States did not get involved until 2 years later. America was trying to stay neutral or not take a side in the war. However, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked America at a place called Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is a naval base in Hawaii off the island of Oahu. It is a place where the U.S. Navy can keep their ships. And while Hawaii wasn't a state at this time, it was a territory, so it was considered a part of America. So on December 7th, 1941, Japanese fighter planes attacked the ships in Pearl Harbor by bombing them. The attack killed thousands of people, and 21 ships were destroyed or damaged. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and a few days after that declared war on Germany. America had officially entered World War II and was fighting against the Axis powers. Now, when a country goes to war, they need a lot of things. They need weapons, they need ships, they need planes, food, uniforms, but the most important thing that they need is manpower. During World War II, millions of Americans enlisted or joined the military to fight for their country. And with that in mind, it's time to reveal our second object. So are you ready, Maureen?
I am.
Okay.
Now, our second object is a primary source, but it also happens to be an article of clothing. So we've put it on a dress form or a mannequin, and you can see how it would have looked when a person was wearing it.
Very cool. We're going to bring the camera to it.
So as I'm showing you our second object, think about what you notice. Think about its size, shape, color, the materials that it's made out of. And just like before, if you want to pause the video or write down your observations, feel free to do so. Once you've gotten a good look at it, try to determine what you think this object is or what it was used for. And remember to use the historical context that we gave you to help. And again, you can take a minute, pause the video, and write down your guesses if you'd like.
Okay.
All right, Catherine, let's start with that first question. What did you notice about this object?
Well, I know it's a jacket and it's blue.
What shade of blue?
Maybe navy?
Right, a navy blue jacket. How about the patches on the lapels? What do you notice about them?
They definitely look like anchors.
Do anchors make you think of anything?
I guess it reminds me of a boat.
Good. And do you know which branch of the military is usually associated with boats?
Oh no! Mice and water usually don't mix.
Oh, that's a good point, Catherine.
I didn't think of that.
Well, the Navy is typically the branch of the military that is associated with boats.
Did the men who wore the uniform serve in the Navy?
Who said it was a man who wore this uniform, Catherine? Remember, our episode is about women's history.
Becca's right. This uniform was worn by a woman named Janet Vitowski, who served in the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, which was the women's branch of the United States Naval Reserve during World War II. Janet was from Kingston, New York, and she served in California.
Oh, she was a little ways away from home. So the military in the 1940s was segregated by both race and gender, and women were typically not allowed to serve in active combat roles. However, that didn't stop millions of women from enlisting in the military. WAVES, or women who joined the Women's Naval Reserve, typically stayed stateside, meaning they didn't go overseas to Europe or Asia. They often did secretarial work like typing and filing. They might have served in hospitals as nurses. They even sometimes managed post offices for naval fleets, and they did a lot more than that.
And the patches on the uniform indicate Janet's rank, as well as the job that she did. And we're fortunate to have a special guest, Joseph Tingley of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, join us today to talk more about Janet's uniform.
Oh, very cool.
He's also going to talk about the WAVES program, the World War II. Welcome, Joseph.
Yay! Hi, Joseph. Welcome from the collection. Let's start with your job. What is your title and what is it that you do at the National World War II Museum?
Yeah, so I work as in the public engagement office. My title is Visitor Engagement Specialist. It does not tell you what I do, my job title, but what I mostly do is I manage our team of 7 tour guides, and they're responsible for conducting tours of our museum. So they're responsible for knowing everything about pretty much every aspect of our exhibits.
Wow.
So I work with them to train them and also work on their presentations so that we are giving our visitors the best experience possible.
That's awesome. That's a lot of responsibility. So it sounds like
you're sometimes.
Yeah. And it sounds like you would be an expert then on all things World War II if you have to train the guides to be able to answer questions like that.
Yeah, it keeps you always going back to doing more research. And one of the things with World War II is it's one of those topics that there are many different parts of it that are really interesting. It's not just one aspect. So we always joke here that there's really always something new to learn and that we're never going to know everything.
That's right. Absolutely.
But that's it. It's really fun to try and learn everything. So.
Wonderful. All right. Well, as you can see, we have a uniform. We know that the woman who wore this uniform, her name was Janet Vitowski. We know she was from Kingston, New York, and we know that she was in the WAVES. But what we kind of want to know more about is her role in the WAVES. And we think that the patches on the uniform will help us figure that out. So I'm just going to slip on some gloves so I can better help you. And I'm going to grab the sleeve. And the first thing we noticed was that there are these two little red chevrons on the side. What would that mean for Janet and the waves?
Yeah, so the chevrons on the side are her rank. But
Okay.
what's interesting about naval ranks is that they actually had your job on your rank as well. So
Oh, cool.
yep, so the two red chevrons there are going to indicate her rank. So that means
Okay.
that she was a petty officer second class.
Okay.
Um, so that is her rank. So that's like if you were in the army, you're probably around like a corporal or a sergeant, kind of similar. But in the middle there, that actually tells us what her job was.
Okay. So this one right above it?
Yep,
All right.
absolutely. And you can see
So
you've
what,
got yep, you've got the wings and a parachute there.
yeah, what does that
And the
mean?
wave, yeah, so the waves did a lot of work with U.S. naval aviators or pilots. The Navy calls them aviators instead of pilots, but the guys who fly the planes. And during World War II, if your plane was going down, it was no longer working, and you had to jump out, you had a parachute. So somebody had to teach these naval aviators how to take care of these parachutes, how to use these parachutes, and they also had to pack these parachutes,
Wow.
which was incredibly important because if you didn't pack it correctly, it might not work when you needed it.
Right.
So this was
Absolutely.
called a parachute rigger because they
Okay.
would rig the parachutes up. So they would have been very, very important in the training of naval aviators, but also in preparing these parachutes for use by these aviators.
Wow.
So,
So Janet would probably be teaching the pilot or the aviators how to use them, and in the event that they had to jump out of the plane, how to do that.
yep. And
Wow.
actually, the WAVES, which WAVES is actually a military acronym for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. It's a bit of a mouthful. But they were very important in training naval aviators in everything from, again, how to use their parachutes to how to navigate, so how to get from place to place in the aircraft, and also even in gunnery, so learning how to shoot at a target that is moving in the air, which obviously is a
Oh.
lot difficult than shooting at something that's stationary on the ground.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Wow. So it sounds like she had a pretty important job then. She
yes, yeah, the
saving
waves.
lives, kind of.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The parachute riggers, even to this day, take a lot of pride in their work because it is so important that people's lives often are in the balance there. So
And we found in newspaper clippings that she was based out of California. And we think that most waves were stationed stateside. That means they weren't going over to like Europe or Asia.
yeah, that is correct. Most of the waves don't see overseas service. Usually, it was women from the Army Nurse Corps or the Women's Army Corps, which was kind of the Army's version of the waves. They were the ones who mostly saw overseas service,
Okay.
in the largest numbers anyway. But the work that they did at home was incredibly important because the military saw as the role of women in the military as if they can take over the job from a man stateside, that man can then be shipped out overseas, or in the case of the Navy, put on a ship that's going into combat. So
And that's why we see on like a lot of propaganda posters that says, if you join the waves, you're freeing up a man to go fight.
exactly.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you, Joseph.
Of
We
course.
also have this patch on the front. It's like a little gold circle. Might be like an eagle inside of it. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so it is an eagle. It is called an honorable discharge patch. And this would traditionally be worn right there on the uniform over the pocket. And the purpose of this was at the end of World War II, you had millions of discharged service members all going home. The problem was our rail system was not equipped to handle millions of service members returning home.
Right.
So often it took them a little longer to get home than normally it would because of all these people trying to get places at once. And a lot of these service members didn't really have civilian clothes anymore. Especially if they had been serving overseas, everything they owned had to fit in a duffel bag. So, you're not bringing an extra suit or an extra outfit, because the military is providing you with what you're going to
Right.
wear. So this would be worn so that they could wear their uniform, even though they were no longer in the military, for 30 days after they were discharged. So this signified that they were, in fact, discharged, that they were not meant to be somewhere, which, not being where you're supposed to be in the military is never good.
Not good.
But this would, again, give them permission to wear that, when they got home, even so that they could go on job interviews and things like that. Before they had the ability to go out and purchase appropriate civilian clothes.
Okay, absolutely makes sense. Fantastic. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the Waves or the National World War II Museum or World War II in general?
No, I mean, with the topic of women in World War II, we recently at the museum had a whole exhibit on this called Our War II. And the title of that came from a really amazing quote from a woman who served overseas with the Women's Army Corps, where she said, it wasn't just my brother's country or my husband's country, it was my country as well. And so this wasn't just their war, it was my war, and I needed to serve in it. So about 350,000 women actually serve in the military during World War II. Many of them do see service overseas. Even about, I believe it's around 100 or 200, 400 women actually worked on the Manhattan Project, which is the project that created the first atomic weapons. So they were incredibly integral to, winning World War II. And even more than that, they really kind of cleared the way for women to serve in the military today.
Absolutely.
Because in 1948, Harry S. Truman signs into law a measure that makes women a permanent part of the U.S. military, and they have been ever since. So
Absolutely.
I think it's a very important legacy that women like the woman who wore this uniform kind of helped clear the way for the women in the military today, which I think is really, really important. So.
Fantastic. Absolutely. And we absolutely agree. I think now women can serve in just about any role in the military. I don't think there's any
Just about, yeah. Yeah.
So
They've continued to expand their roles in the military and, serving right alongside, the men in the military as well. Yeah.
absolutely, which is wonderful to hear. And we need to keep that going.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for this. We've learned a ton, and I really appreciate you coming in and telling us all about this uniform and Janet's role in the Waves when she was serving.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today, Joseph. We really appreciate it.
Wow, go Janet! What a cool job and what an important job!
You are absolutely right, Catherine. Women had an essential role in helping the United States and our allies win World War II. And women like Janet, who served in the military during World War II, helped pave the way for the women who came after them. Today, women can serve in just about any role in the military. They command ships, they fly planes, they lead troops in battle, and more. And just like in the past, women today continue to inspire and influence people to fight for what is right. Well, everyone, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us for another episode of From the Collection. Catherine, great to see you. Thanks for stopping by. Hope you learned something new about women's history.
Oh, I did! I can't wait to tell Zopha all about today's objects. He's going to love hearing about them. Happy Women's History Month, everyone!
Aww. Bye, Catherine. And of course, a big thank you to you, Maureen, for sharing some more interesting items from our collection here at the museum.
You're very welcome.
Yes. All right, and now that you at home have learned about some of the objects in the Chapman Museum's collection, we want you to create a piece of art that incorporates one of the objects we discussed today. So you can draw a picture, you can write a story, come up with a song, a poem, something else, and you can send your art to me at educator@chapmanmuseum.org, along with your first name, and it just might be featured on our social media pages. All right, so thank you to all of you at home for joining us today. Make sure you check back next month for another episode of From the Collection. Until then, have a great day, keep on learning, and make sure to visit us at the museum. We have tons of cool stuff. Bye.